interesting. And our other guest is, I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, but I'll try, Marisol Castañeda Salgado, who worked in both Mexico and the United States prior to coming to the school. She has a particular interest in using community education to bring about social change, as well as in restorative justice, and we're going to talk about those things today. Today we're going to talk about two different forms of violence that affect Latinas, intimate partner violence, and also the violence outside the family. And we're going to start by talking about what happens before Latinas from Mexico and Central America come to the United States and the kind of violence that they experience. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I was born and raised in Mexico, and as it's like well known and sad at the same time, Latin America has like different issues related to violence against women. So in my previous job and in my previous experience in Mexico, I had the chance to work with different populations, specifically with youth and women, young women, in Mexico City who were living on the streets. Some of them were coming from, were immigrants in Mexico from Central America, from the Triangle, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and like the different dynamics that intersect in the phenomenon of domestic violence that Yasmin will explain better than me, probably. There are different dynamics that like come together in relation to violence against women. In Latin America, we live in a machista society still that has its roots in post-colonial moments. But yeah, that's like my experience. And
so what kind of violence, you've got women who are coming from the Triangle, as you called it, into Mexico, and that is a more complicated situation, I would guess, than for a Mexican woman. But all of them are at risk of significant violence.
Yes.
And what kind of violence do they experience?
Well, now there's a new understanding of violence against women, and it's actually in Mexico. Mexico was the first country that typified feminicidios, femicides, which is the homicide committed against women based on just gender.
So some of these women are actually murdered?
Yes. 9 women per day are murdered in Mexico. And in Latin America in general, 60,000 women per year. So
my understanding is that rate is about the highest in the world?
Yes, that's the highest rate in the world. And not only Latin America is like the lead on that specific phenomenon, but Honduras and Salvador occupy the first rates. So when we talk about migration dynamics, we can understand now with the previous like caravana migrante, the migrant caravan, a lot of women from Honduras, El Salvador were trying to come to the States in order to find better lives.
Some of the women are murdered.
Yes.
Obviously the women who are migrating have not been murdered.
Yes.
But they're at risk of some significant violence. And I mean, we read in the headlines, the newspaper, that women are coming from Guatemala and El Salvador, Honduras, I guess, as well.
Yes.
And they're afraid of gang violence.
Yes.
And they're afraid of sexual violence. Can you say something about?
Yes. They're afraid of violence in general in the society. You mentioned gang violence, and it's something that has been uprising in the Triangle due to economic injustices, that structural dynamics that happen like within economy.
Well, we can come back to that, but let's specifically what's happening to the women.
So there's like violence in the communities.
Right.
Trans women and women are usually the most affected by violence in those communities because of the machismo understanding of life. Men are supposed to be on top of the dynamics and the decision makers. So when that happens, women try to flee, when they survive to violence, sometimes they just take their children and try to find a better
So are
life.
they escaping what get called now intimate partner relationships.
Yes.
They're escaping their husbands or partners, whatever their relationship is, men with whom they've had children, and they're taking the children and running.
Yes.
And they're trying to get into a safe place. So what happens when they get on the road?
Well, that's, if we think about like the process of getting to the United States, there's a lot of data that suggests that in that, en el camino, in the way to the United States, in the path, they also get involved in violent dynamics of sexual abuse, gang-related violence in the past through Mexico because of the organized crime that in Mexico takes place as well. When they get to the United States, then we also find there were some articles that were on the New York Times, I think a few weeks ago, related to sexual abuse inside of detention centers. So there's like a continuous
And the sexual abuse inside the detention centers, is that fellow migrants, or is it the people who are presumably trying to keep them safe and well in the detention centers, or both?
I don't want to suggest because I'm not sure, but in what I've read and what it was said, that it's like fellow.
It's
fellow
people who are also
detained.
trying to get
Yes.
into the United States.
Yes.
And so the women are at greater risk than presumably the men are.
Yes. So if you really
I
think...
wonder to what extent that extends to children, if you know. Is there a lot of abuse of the children as well?
I'm not sure. I don't want to...
Of course, a lot of the kids have
yeah.
been separated, but that's a topic for another time.
Yes.
All right, so we have this situation then in which women are trying to escape from violent relationships, violent communities, and where they feel very much at risk, and they come to the United States in the hopes that they can get through the hoops that you have to jump through to be legally in the United States, and you see them once they're here.
Yeah. So I specifically am working more with victims and survivors of domestic violence, and sexual abuse is part of domestic violence that's happening with the intimate partner. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing a lot of unique adverse experiences. Well, as domestic violence is already such a complex, and I mean complex issue, now we have the additional barriers such as language barriers, right? Maybe not speaking English or speaking a different language, which can be really a power dynamic that the perpetrator can use to control, especially if there's a police report. There's also things that we're seeing as financial risks, so making it really difficult once they flee and they're in physical safety now. Now, what happens with all the economic barriers that are coming, right? So many of these survivors are coming with their family and children, and it makes it difficult if you can't find a fair wage job if you are undocumented and do not have a work permit.
The question I asked you first, I think, was misstated on my part.
Okay.
Because I said that we're talking about women who had managed to jump through the hoops and get here legally authorized. But in fact, a lot of people are here who are undocumented.
Yes.
And I'm very curious whether their life situations are different from those who are here and they're here authorized. So for the women who are here without documentation, are the risks greater?
Yes, I want to be careful in not minimizing any victim or survivor's experience, but yes, I think that there is just these additional barriers that make it very difficult. Legal barriers, which are, maybe not, like I was mentioning, financial risks, not being able to work and get a fair wage paying job, to find economic relief.
So in that kind of situation, a woman who is unable to support herself then becomes dependent on whoever she's in a intimate partner relationship with, and that becomes a tremendous hold on
control,
the women.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
Often when we have conversations about domestic violence, questions that get raised, well, why did the woman stay?
Absolutely.
And certainly one of the reasons that women stay is they've got very little economic choice.
Yeah, economic is something to very much be paying more attention to.
Yeah.
There's also just the fear of, if I report, will I get deported?
Right.
And which puts them back to the pre-migration trauma, right?
Right.
As if this is not now a post-migration trauma. Social isolation is
So
also...
getting an order of protection is not so easy for somebody who's
Right.
here and is undocumented.
Yes.
Right. And just those fears. Another one that I think is really important is the social isolation.
Right.
Many of these victims and survivors migrate over here by themselves, maybe families still behind, some children, or they only came with their children and not really interacting with their community because of the power and control dynamic that's getting exerted from the other partner. And so, really feeling like, well, if I report, what about my child? Will
Right.
I get deported? And where will my child go? And so there's all these fears.
And for people who are here with authorization, I would assume some of these same dynamics are at work.
Yeah.
It's different.
Yeah.
And probably in some ways less severe, but still significant. And the forms of violence that we're talking about are basically I shouldn't put it this way, plain old domestic violence. Domestic violence, of course, takes place in all ethnic groups. It's not limited to Latinas or any minority group.
Yeah.
Domestic violence takes place.
It doesn't discriminate,
Right.
right? And thank you for addressing that. Yeah, it's about power and control. So
are there different issues that you think with the Latinx community than there are in general, or are we talking about you keep calling them power dynamics? I like to talk about them in terms of the specific elements of the, put in a cumbersome way, unfreedom that women experience. So if they can't earn a living, that's a problem. If they can't go to court, that's a problem. If there's particular violence, a greater sense of danger, then that's a problem. If they have children and they're afraid of losing their children, which is that's another kind of problem.
Or getting deported, and once they
Right.
get deported,
Right.
being killed there.
yeah.
When they
Right.
get back home. So
Right.
there's also documentation of that happening.
Right.
Now, when there were some changes established by Jeff Sessions about who could seek for asylum or refugee, and gender-based violence is not one of those options, then women fear that they will get deported. And once they get
that
deported,
brings us to a very important question, which is, what can we do about this? And one of the things that you're pointing to is immigration policy
Yes.
In the United States. So the determination that domestic violence doesn't count as a form of violence that you can get asylum for, that certainly is a problem. What are some of the other things that you would like to see changed, whether it's in immigration policy or in other policy arenas?
my field, it's education.
Okay.
So I tried through transformative and popular education lens and community education lens, I'm aiming to create communities that sustain accountability.
That sustain accountability. And what does that mean?
So whenever someone in a community, let's say that this is a community of 3, when there's harm, when harm takes place in this community, how can we address it in a way that if you cause the harm to Michael, we can hold Yasmin accountable, but allow Yasmin to transform herself and to prevent that harm to be taken again. So it's thinking about harm as something that happens due to a structural dynamics that and systemic dynamics that talk through us, but by critically reflecting and dialogue and in dialogue and in.
So this is very interesting. I'm cutting you off because we have very little time.
Yes.
At the moment.
And I can Google.
Maybe we should talk more about this
Yes.
another time. I know you're also interested in the concept of restorative justice.
Yes.
So you talk about transformative. I'm not sure what the adjective applies
They're
to.
different, but it's a deep conversation. Yeah,
it's a
they're
deep
different.
conversation.
Yes.
All right. So there's something transformative that
and
you think
something
can happen
restorative.
through community education.
Yes.
And also that there's some process of restorative justice,
Yes.
which we don't have time to elucidate today, unfortunately.
Yes.
What about this? You do policy work. You're on your way down to Washington.
Yeah.
And you're a nice young person. You're going to fix the world. You know, old people like me failed to do that adequately. So
Yasmin will do it.
What are you going to do?
Well, I think psychoeducation is such a big piece, and not just to service providers, but just in the community as well, as some of what Marisol was talking about. One thing I'm really concentrated on working and advocating more towards is the Violence Against Women Act, which is the VAWA, and in order to self-petition for a green card, a visa, there's still the spousal requirement. And you could see that can cause a lot of oppression and exclusion to many communities, specifically the LGBTQI community. And that's because, federally gay marriage only became legal in 2015. But if there was intimate partner violence happening before 2015 and partners couldn't get married due to that, then there's that barrier. There's also...
So this is a piece of legislation, which I'm not aware of. It's a piece of legislation that would make it possible for women to...
and men, and men, yeah.
To apply for green cards without having the support of a spouse.
Yes.
So...
and without their support and having to be notified. However, it's still the spousal requirement. And,
now what is the spousal requirement?
It needs to be someone who was your batter, needed to be either your husband or wife, either currently or in the past, ex.
I see. So more to be discussed about that
Yes.
as well, but I think we have a question here. I heard the presenters speak of the, how do you say that? Machismo culture in Latinx communities. Can you speak more to the gender socialization and if there are ways we can work with families and young people around these inequities? I'm not sure I understand that, but do you?
I guess that it's about like the gender socialization, and based on my understanding of the question, like there's an respectability politics. What does that mean? When you're expected to behave in a way within your society that can be different in each country or in each state within a country, you have to fulfill specific requirements to be considered a woman, a good woman, and specifically talking about women. So what we have been observing related to machismo is that whenever there's a violence dynamic in Mexico, you tend to observe the dynamic as something that the woman provoked, because she was wearing a miniskirt, she was not behaving properly as a woman should, she was laid outside, so it's all putting the blame on the victims or survivors.
Yeah,
of the
victim
violence. Yeah.
So there is an issue about, again, to put it excessively simplistically, how people are raised to play different gender roles.
Yes.
And there are certain expectations of men that can lead in one way or another to abuse, and there are expectations of women that also contribute to that.
Yes.
To normalize gender-based violence.
Yeah.
And here, without mentioning about trans women who are in higher risk of harassment and violence, because they are not just not going with the flow of what a woman should be. They're actually challenging the paradigms of what
they're
gender
challenging
is.
everything.
Yes.
Right. Do you find that in this climate, immigrant women who are survivors of domestic and sexual violence feel increasingly deterred from seeking civil protective restraining orders in family court?
I believe at times, yes, especially now that we're seeing that sometimes ICE is right outside of our courts. There's just so many different dynamics. There's also just, not wanting to not have their children see the father even though they want to separate, not wanting to take that away, or fearing, even though I don't want to be with the other parent right now, I don't necessarily want him to be deported. And that kind of goes on a different level. And also ACS gets involved.
ACS is the Administration for Children's Services in New York.
Yes.
And there are similar
Yes.
governmental structures
Throughout.
everywhere.
Yeah.
Right? But
Yeah.
ACS.
Yeah, and so then it just becomes, this multi amount of service providers, and it could just be very, very intimidating for someone who is not really familiar with our laws and the options and protections.
So it sounds like one of the things that you'd like to work on over time is court reform and also some changes in the child protective system.
Yes.
So the Administration for Children's Services has the primary responsibility of child welfare, and you're pointing to a need for some changes there.
Yes, the screening shouldn't be so black and white. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good luck in Washington, given the current budget proposal.
Yes.
But for everybody worrying about that budget proposal, keep in mind it's not real. It's not going to go very far.
Yeah.
But it's still not great for things like child welfare.
Yeah.
Please talk about I'm sorry, what exactly is restorative justice? So you have 10 words.
Yeah, what exactly is restorative justice? Exactly, it's it puts a lot of pressure on me. So I will say that restorative justice, it's a theory that believes in the restoration or reparation of harm within communities or within relationships. So the methodology embraces the idea of fostering dialogue and understanding about who caused and answering to questions, and this is super simplistic, but like answering questions such like who caused the harm, who was harmed, and how can be done to address the harm in order to fulfill the needs of the person that was harmed. So super simplistic.
Okay. Please talk about the effect that violence has on the children. How can we educate families to protect them?
Yeah, well, as we know, is that there is a cycle of violence, and violence is also a learned behavior. And so this makes a big impact on our children who are affected and survivors also of domestic violence. I think one of my most interesting experiences when I used to work at a DV shelter is that we're not only seeing large numbers of women, but we're also seeing the large numbers in children and how they're being affected and the kind of supports that are important to get connected with, and making sure that other service providers in the community are aware of how to hold a space for these children, which are the teachers and tutors and pediatricians, and ways that we can, I'm a little blind, I can't really see, how can we educate families?
Educate families to protect them.
Advocacy, I think, through many community advocacy, so going to schools, talking about healthy relationships. Often we're talking about safe sex, but we're not talking about what healthy boundaries look like, emotional, what's respect, what's consent, what are something that we might come off as a red flag. And this isn't just in intimate relationships, also in friendships.
A lot of these kids have got to be emotionally very distressed, to put it mildly. It seems to me that kids who live in families where there's substantial domestic violence taking place in their presence, as it always is in one way or another, even if it's they're put into the room when something's going on, they can hear, they know what's going on, and it has to have a very powerful impact on them. Are there ways that social workers outside can interact with these kids that help the kids to heal or to deal with this?
I believe yes. I was, previous of my field placement right now, I used to have an internship at Legal Aid Society, and I was actually inside of the family courts.
Right.
ACS, all that stuff. So one of the things I realized that really social workers were doing that were actually impacting the children is allowing them to have a space for them to express. Because between all these like family dynamics of violence or abuse, children are usually put aside, and we tend to not like listen to their voices. So it's really important to listen to the children's voices, their understanding of what's going on, psychoeducation.
So it's a really interesting observation that the kids come into court, they then get put into a waiting room. There may be somebody there to watch them, but it's not always the case that there's a trained person who can
Exactly.
interact with the children in
Yes.
a way that might be helpful to them.
Yes.
So that's certainly one way of doing it. Did you have other thoughts about that?
Yeah, mine goes back also to psychoeducation. I think
Yeah.
it's such an important piece. I mean, that's some of the videos we're seeing in the family courts are the impacts, psychological impacts it's making on the children. Many children are blaming themselves, trying to, rationalize what's irrational behavior. And so allowing a safe space for the child to really process and also heal is really important.
Yes.
So we have a question coming up which takes us in a somewhat different direction. You're being asked for a political opinion. Feel free to give it or not, as you choose. Do you feel more optimistic and supported with the recent increase of congresswomen, not to mention some of them who are Latinas? Are any of you or the organizations that you collaborate with, do you have any approach with them? Again, I'm not quite sure what that means. But the first question is, what do you think? We're seeing some political changes take place in the United States.
And in Mexico, I have to say.
Oh,
Yes.
well, what's
Yes.
going on in Mexico?
Now there are laws of parity. So that means that in Congress, in the government cuerpos, there has to be a specific amount of women. So that can be tricky because it doesn't matter if you have a lot of women and you don't listen to women. But slow steps.
So where do you have to, is this in a legislature?
Yeah, legislaturas.
So how do you do that? You have an election and
They have to have a specific amount of women in the different bodies within the governments to address the different issues that can be related to women
really
or
interesting.
science or
That's
any topic.
really
Yeah.
interesting. We're nowhere near that. I mean, we're certainly seeing many more women elected, and it's changing the complexion, sort of literally, of the Congress of the United States. But there's no requirement.
Right.
No, in
do
Mexico there is.
So are you encouraged by this here in the United States?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah. It's nice, especially to see more women of color.
Yes.
So it's wonderful. And
Okay. Two more questions. All right. How do you see the predominant culture in the United States as being different from the culture these women are fleeing? Well, that's a really... So are they better off? Wait a second. We've got
loaded
women
question.
who are running away from the Triangle and from Mexico and from terrible violence, and they come into the United States, and now you're
Fleeing
telling us
domestic
about the
violence.
violence that they experience here. So this is an interesting question. Essentially, are they better off once they come here, and what's the difference in the two cultures?
I will have to say that I couldn't speak for them.
right.
So are they better off? Probably they have the answer.
Yes.
But what I've seen is that they flee for a reason, and that's like the only thing that I could think about. Because they flee for a reason. Are they better here or in their countries due to cultural and different forms of violence?
I guess part of the question is there a difference in levels of violence, risks of violence? And this person said in two cultures. We're talking about more than two cultures.
Yeah.
Right.
It depends where they're coming from south of our border, and it depends on where they're going in the United States and what communities that they're part of, because we don't have a singular American culture.
Yes.
I'm sure Mexico doesn't have a singular
No.
Mexican culture.
Right.
And I spent time in Honduras, and a small community, felt totally safe wandering around all the time, and was also in a large city in Honduras where I wouldn't leave the hotel because there were 3 armed guards at the door.
Yeah.
Totally different experiences in different parts of the country. So it's a complex question. I like your answer.
Let me say one thing.
All right,
What I think that makes the difference is having the resources to support the people. Specialized resources. Investing on that. Divesting on prison. Divesting on different programs that are maybe not pushing for a difference, specifically in populations that we know that are usually vulnerable around the world, not the United States, not Mexico, not Honduras, the world. Women, trans women, children, people of color.
Wow, we've opened up a whole big can here. I think we have one last question and then we have to end. It says, I'm wondering if the two guests are worried that in talking about violence against Latinx women, they are playing into Trump's hand, since he is always talking about Mexican rapists, migrant caravan women being raped, etc. So...
Yeah,
okay.
This is a conversation.
Marisol turns it over to you.
Because it's the hard
Go
one.
ahead.
We're not, and at least those are not our intentions. I am very careful with that, and Marisol and I have had this conversation before, is that it's important to know that this gender-based violence that we're talking about is specifically violence against women, is mostly on a power and control dynamic. And as we talked about machismo, we also are seeing toxic masculinity here. And it's not just a fear of this anti-immigrant. It's happening in low socioeconomic status, high, different parts of the world. And it's not just a focus on immigrants. It's a focus in many communities that we need to pay more attention to.
So bottom line, Trump doesn't have it right.
Exactly.
And nothing you're saying supports his vision
Absolutely.
of the world. And on that note,
thank you, Michael.
Oh, apparently we're not going to stop. We're going longer and longer.
All
Our
right.
half-hour show is increasingly longer than that. So have you observed any shifts in behavior of the Mexican government in addressing these border issues since Obrador has taken office?
So just to give you a little context, López Obrador is the new elected president. He started his presidency term in December. And there's an initiative that, and he's talking about this with the U.S. government, about investing actually in different projects that are focused, or their target population or countries are Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, El Triángulo. That's how they name it. So yes, there are some, programs and projects
offering asylum.
Yeah, exactly. And also, he opened the opportunity for the caravans to go through Mexico, arrive to the U.S. border, and he allowed them, or the federal government allowed them to stay in Mexico during the process in the U.S.
Are there any kind of services that are provided for these caravans while they're waiting in Mexico?
Yes, there are different organizations. I don't know if they are connected or if they work as a network, but I know that in the south, specifically in the states of Chiapas, Oaxaca, Pueblos Sin Fronteras is one of the main organizations that goes with the caravan to protect them, and a lot of community organizing and creating leadership within the immigrants. But yes, there are different organizations, and it depends on which state they are at, in the north and the south.
Any last words, Yasmin?
Thank you. Then this was really great. Yeah, and let's continue to advocate in many ways and to fight against domestic violence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts?
Invest in programs that are oriented for the populations we talked about.
Well, that's a very important message. Invest. That means put some money into this, folks. And as I always say to social workers, you should pick a cause and put some money into it. Here's a cause.
Your heart.
Put some money into it. Where can they
your
send?
Your heart.
When can they? I want them to send money. You know any place they can send money that would be helpful on this? We'll tell you another time.
Nonprofits.
I'm sure you can do a little research and find some places to spend your money. So thank you for tuning in today. We will not be back next week because it's spring break. The following week we will be back with Heidi Allen, who is an associate professor here, or I think she's an associate professor. In any case, she's the school's expert on health policy, and we're going to have a conversation about health policy in the United States. We will talk some about myths related to Medicaid, but I think we're probably going to end up talking a lot about what's called Medicare for All, which is a very complicated arena, and because most of what's called Medicare for All is not, in fact, that. So we'll have some conversation about that. Thanks again for joining us today. Thank you to our guests. You are very impressive. We've
Thank
got
you.
some great
Gracias.
students, great students here at Columbia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Besos a mi mami.